Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program concludes our conversation with Elana Haviv, founder and executive director of Generation Human Rights and co-chair of Human Rights Educators USA. In this episode, Elana discusses the importance of examining the origins of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in light of critiques from a decolonial perspective, the relationship of human rights education to social justice, threats to human rights emerging from the rise of authoritarianism around the globe, future trends in the global HRE movement, role models who have influenced her work in HRE, and her recommendations for advancing human rights education in the United States. So I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you to talk about, one of the continuing debates in the field of human rights is the issue of the historic origins within which the UDHR was developed. One argument is that it was very reliant on Western European models of human rights and democracy, and others argue that it's basically the vestige of a colonial critique. In other words, the idea being we have to challenge that and approach it from a decolonial perspective. So how do you sort of respond to that critique and the idea that human rights is basically something from the global north and not meaningful for the global south?
I respond to it when I'm in areas in the global south, asking what human rights means to them. What is it to them, right? I am very well aware of the history of the UDHR and the perspective it's coming from. And I'm careful with it, I guess you'd say. And I don't, it is not my role. I haven't chosen my role to focus on the decolonization of these documents which were created, but it is my role to acknowledge the history, and when I'm introducing it, to talk about that and open up discussions. To be perfectly honest, I've never brought the UDHR into my work in Bosnia or in other areas. We do talk about how do we respect other people, other human beings. What does that mean? In the U.S., in classrooms here, when we teach about the foundation of human rights, I do have lessons specifically about the UDHR. And then I have students work in partners or groups to create their own UDHR. Like, what rights do you see that aren't in here that are specific to you and your community? And I do that with the teachers as well. So if that answers your question, and I think this is something important about the way I work and the teams I work with and create, is we always want input from those in the other areas we work in, and the target audience, and we always want to include youth voices within that. So that's helpful. And I think sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
And then there's another, I would say, interesting debate going on right now, and that is the relationship of human rights education to social justice. And so what are your thoughts about the conceptualization of how human rights education relates to social justice? Is it a foundation? Is it part of a larger umbrella? What would you say?
I consider my role as a human rights educator is to bring to these classrooms or create lessons that are brought to classrooms where the issues are brought up. The issues are brought up where students are able to see things through different perspectives, where they're able to weigh evidence, and then it's their choice of whether or not to step into the role of human rights defenders or youth change makers. I In our youth programs outside of the classroom, when youth want to create something like the Youth Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina or the exhibit I talked to you about or so many other projects we've done, when that comes from the youth, we support it. We're right there. We work with them on it. But for what's created in the classrooms, I very much have a more hands-off approach in terms of what they decide to do. I mean, we have how do you take action curriculum? Like, how do you design a strategy to make a difference in your community? What's that strategy? How do you design a sustainable project? But it's really in their hands. I had someone recently say, how can you be teaching, like, why do you think it's your right to teach students how to protest? And I said, I don't teach students how to protest. That's their choice. I'm providing them the knowledge of what's happening so that they can research it and they can weigh evidence. And more than once, we haven't gotten grant because we're told we're too political. And actually, I try to keep generation human rights, as weird as this sounds, as neutral as possible. I mean, we're teaching about human rights, but how that's processed and how that moves on, the ripple effect, we're not forcing that to happen. I don't know if I'm making sense, but the social justice aspect, that is the outcome. It's not what we're specifically teaching.
Right. So if I can understand, you're saying that you advocate that they become much more knowledgeable about social justice and related issues of human rights, but the option for them to take action is their own.
Yes,
So
that's their own.
how would you then respond to the comment that, well, in a society that's so politically polarized as the United States today, that can only feed the polarization? How would you respond to that?
I think it's important for students, if they choose to have a voice, to have a voice. And maybe that will add to the polarization. And maybe it takes something like that for it to blow up as it has. And maybe that has to happen in order for real dialogue and real healing to take place. I don't mean blow up violently. I don't mean that might be the wrong word, but um, something's got to give over time, right? And we're in a horrible time right now in the US, and I don't know what that's going to be or how long that's going to take. But if it's adding to the polarization, then that's what's happening. I mean, everyone should have a voice and be able to use their voice.
Okay, let me move on to another important question, I think, about what's actually happening in this country today. I mean, there are real serious threats to human rights in this country. For example, censorship, challenges on academic freedom, restrictions of voting rights, violence against minorities, very little movement on poverty, gun violence, migrants, and so forth. So, within your project or within the scope of HRE USA, is there one issue there you feel that you would tackle going forward, and how would your Generation Human Rights Project approach it? Could be any one of the ones I mentioned or a different one.
I think we have different curriculum that's available open source that tackles most of the subjects that you just spoke about. And I think that especially with the Millennium Village project, we have multiple open source uh, multimedia-based lessons that are available to classrooms. The problem is do these teachers feel comfortable using it? And like we are in a moment where teachers who normally teach about human rights defenders are actually themselves having to step into the roles of being human rights defenders. And that's not what they signed up for, right? And I started reading earlier. I didn't finish it yet, but these teachers who were told that they couldn't teach the Holocaust in their classroom unless they taught it through multiple perspectives from all sides. then you get into a thing of well, we want multi-perspectivity to be taught, especially around historical events. But where do you draw the line? And what does that mean? These teachers are like, what exactly are you telling us to do? You know? Um, and there are some teachers that I think lost their jobs. I haven't finished, like I said, reading that. So it's a very tricky time. And I'm very happy that there are new networks that are opening up right now to support teachers during this time period. Like the Right to Learn is new. I've been going to some of their meetings. And then HRE USA, we are a fantastic human rights network for human rights educators. And so it's, we're supporting the dialogue with teachers across the country to give them the support they need. Uh, it's it's a very scary time. And I remember before the 2016 election, a friend of mine in Bosnia saying, watch what's going to happen in your country. So and so is going to win, and there's going to be this big shift, this big move. And I thought, no way, not possible. And now we have there are areas in this country that they're actually burning books, not only banning them from libraries, but burning them. So we have to wake up because this can happen anywhere at any time to any country. And right now, it's so important that we support our teachers in any way possible.
Well, that reminds me of someone who once asked me when I was teaching a class on the Holocaust, are we going to talk about whether it happened? And I said, no, we're not, because we're not going to discuss things that aren't true. Because I don't think the real object of studying things is to give credence to lies. So I think it's important to examine, for example, the various historical arguments about why it happened, but I'm not going to entertain the discussion, was there a Holocaust? No, that's established.
Right.
It's a historical fact. We're not going there. And I think
Right.
that's an important issue because we have too much disinformation today. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, there is too much disinformation, and it's getting worse by the moment. And it's incredible how much AI can help in certain areas, and it's incredible how much it can distort things. And now every time I do like a test online, like what photo is created by AI and what photo isn't, I get it wrong. I get them
Mhm.
wrong. So I'm having trouble identifying what's disinformation and what's not.
Let me move on to our next question, which is you and I have already sort of inferred this or implied it so far, but there's this huge change in the world now with the rise of authoritarian governments in Russia, Hungary, Venezuela, and the Republican Party in this country, I think, would be fairly accurately described as having authoritarian elements in it. That poses a real challenge for human rights education. So, what are some of the things you feel that have to be done to try to deal with that development?
Honestly, Bill, I really feel we need to build stronger communities and networks. So many of us are dealing with this and we have different tactics to deal with it. So let's share our tactics. Let's come together more. Let's talk about this. Let's learn from each other. Let's create a movement a real movement of teachers, of educators, who are acknowledging what's happening around us, and instead of being in dealing with it in our classrooms in our smaller communities, let's come together. So that's what I have to say about that. I think that's really the only thing, of course, voting and supporting certain candidates, but in terms of the simplest way to have the most effective way to build strength, it's networking.
Okay, so let me extend that a little further. If you develop, or not you, but let's say for argument's sake, Human Rights Educators USA develops more partnerships and networks with other groups, what would you argue would be the core message? Because as we mentioned before, there's an awful lot of conflicting viewpoints and different disinformation, for lack of a better term. So what would be the core message that that type of community would be developing and sharing with the public, not just with their own people, with the public?
I don't think it's time yet to share with the public. If you're just starting to form this network and this collaboration, I would say the first thing is to share what's going on with you. What are you most concerned about? And start there and then build in that way. And then share with the public if it makes sense, if that's what's needed. There are some really good reasons why some teachers don't want to share things with in the public, right? So really, I think it has to start somewhere. It has to start with conversations, start with the dialogue, and then build for that. And let's say if you have 50 teachers across the US, you're starting with a dialogue, and then maybe that breaks up into smaller groups. Maybe there's certain things that they're focused on where they can support each other, and it breaks up into smaller groups, and then we'll see what they bring to the public. I shared earlier that we offer the free professional development online, um, and we have teachers from certain countries around the world that come in and they just have a little black box, in Zoom, our little Brady Bunch boxes, a little black box, and they're on mute that whole time. And then I'll realize later they were coming from countries in certain parts of the world where human rights is forbidden to be taught. So they were just coming in just to listen. So everyone has different needs. But it all starts with conversation.
Okay. So, as we conclude our conversation, here are some questions I ask of every person on the podcast. And let me start with this one. Who would you say was the most influential role model for your work in human rights education? That could be someone who's passed and someone who's alive today.
Okay. So, uh, honestly, it's not an individual. I think the most influential role models for me, especially right now, they have no names, they have no faces, and these are the teachers around the world who are leading lessons in secret basements during wars, especially with girls. And I've had the chance to create some curriculum for some of these spaces in Afghanistan. And these these are the educators who inspire me every day. And a lot of times when I'm doing something, I feel I'm doing it to support them. So they're risking so much and they're doing so much great work. So those are my influential role models. They have no names or faces. Yeah.
Okay. What quote most effectively sums up your view of the importance of human rights?
Well, I'm going to share the a quote from one of our youth who took part in creating our Imagine Next Gen Voices Reflect on Peace curriculum, which is an open source multimedia based curriculum that anyone can get on our website, Generation Human Rights. And this was a quote from Melina, who's 20 in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And she says, "Do not underestimate the power we hold as young people or underestimate the power of our voice." And for me, human rights education, what's most important for me is opening up spaces for people to have their voice. And since I focus on high school, it's the young people to have their voice.
Okay. And lastly, if you had the power to make one critical change to advance human rights education in the United States, what would you recommend?
First of all, that human rights education is not separate from any other subject. I mean, I think human rights education is to be infused in every subject. It should never be a separate subject. I mean, not it should never be, but it shouldn't be looked upon as that. So if you're learning about math and you're learning statistics, talk about food scarcity in your community or a neighboring community. What are the stats? That's all available. You're studying current events and historical events, and how does that tie into, let's say, articles of the UDHR or the Convention on Genocide or whatever it is. So let's not look at it as separate. Let's start to just integrate it right into all these other lessons. And for several of our curriculums available online, they'll have the lessons, and then it will say what standards it meets, and then it will say what human rights it touches upon, what human rights topics it touches upon. So try to make it within everything. But that's what I would say.
Would you also connect that to requiring that there be study of human rights or human rights education for teacher certification?
Oh, yes, please. I have sat in well, okay, this is a few years ago. I sat in at the Teaching for Tolerance Museum in New York City, and they were doing this great this great in-person professional development for teachers. And I think there are like 50 or 60 teachers there on genocide. And they started by asking the teachers, what is a genocide? And they didn't know. And then someone said a civil war like in Rwanda. So this needs to be part of a pre-service for teachers, so they have that knowledge. And I love doing pre-service teacher training because it's fantastic to be able to add this, but it should be within that system.
Well, that's a very interesting extension too, because a number of people we've asked this question of have mentioned that. And I think it's a challenge. You're dealing with educational bureaucracies, you're dealing with state education departments, but it's simply, or it seems to me to be something that most people want. Maybe it's something we at HRE USA need to talk more about.
Yeah, maybe we could create our own pre-service program. It's just a matter of how many teachers would know about it and sign up for it, but just to start that way. And there are pre-service programs around the country who are open to this. I know this because I go to these places and I do pre-service programs on human rights with these pre-service teachers. So it's a gap, and it's one that HRE USA can definitely begin to fill.
Well, I'm with you. So let's make that a conversation topic going forward. I want to thank you very much, Elana, for spending time with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bill. This was great. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy at hreusa.org. That's KRISTI@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Rodelius Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Terbruggen, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.